Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our journey, A Prophet in Babylon, Chapter 9, Part A. The mail the next morning brought Gaunt a long letter from Paul Gordon. In this letter, Gordon said that he had never expected to be drawn again into any kind of public activity. He had regarded himself as having earned the right to rest. But the conversation with Gaunt had changed his mind. He felt now that a new occasion had arisen which might rightfully demand from him any powers of service which might still be left to him. It was not clear to him as yet what form of service might be possible to him, but he would like to come to New York and talk matters over with Gaunt. Gaunt at once invited him to be his guest, and a day later Gordon arrived. Gaunt arranged that Palmer should meet him that same evening at dinner. Gordon at once recognized the sympathetic qualities of Palmer's mind. The three men talked far into the night. It was one of those delightful talks which range easily over many fields of thought, touching various themes with lightness and grace. The only kind of talk which deserves the name conversation, because it concerns itself with ideas over which full and flexible minds can join in happy contention. It was not, however, till the next morning that Gordon mentioned the subject of his letter. "If you are free today," he said to Gaunt, "I want to take you on a little pilgrimage with me. I'm not sure that you have yet grasped some of the elements of your problem, and I can best explain them by a study of the facts." "I am in your hands," said Gaunt. "Very good," said Gordon. "But before we start, I warn you that our pilgrimage may not be a pleasant one. Let me ask you one question. Do you know New York with any kind of exactitude or completeness?" "I'm afraid not," said Gaunt. "To tell you the truth, I've only lately realized that for 7 years I've gone up and down in this little section of the city, and that is all." "It's not surprising," said Gordon. "It is a common characteristic of a city dweller. A city so large as New York or London is, after all, only a series of villages joined together by the loosest kind of municipal bond. Men dwell in their own villages, the rich in one, the poor in another, knowing next to nothing of each other. We complain, and justly, that when brilliant men of letters visit us and go home to write books about us, they invariably convey false impressions and arrive at absurd conclusions. Of course, the reason is plain. They just see one of the many villages of which New York consists, and their kind friends who entertain them take particular care that they shall not stray beyond the bounds. Here, for example, is an example from a recent article by an English visitor, which I thought worth preserving. Read it." He drew from his pocketbook a carefully folded press cutting and handed it to Gaunt. The writer of the article was evidently in love with America. He praised indiscriminately all that he had seen. According to his account, there was no vice in New York, no visible drunkenness, no dire poverty. Every man earned excellent wages, and if he did not, it was his own fault. No wonder 1,000,000 immigrants flocked every year to the harbor of New York, recognizing in the gigantic Statue of Liberty, which guarded the magnificent waterway, a hand that beckoned them to plenty and wealth. America alone among the nations of the earth provided a table in the wilderness at which the starving millions of the Old World found a welcome and an inheritance, and so forth through 1,000 words or more of indiscriminate adulation. The writer went on. "Well," said Gordon, as Gaunt handed the paper back to him. "Of course it's flamboyant nonsense," said Gaunt. "Exactly," said Gordon. "But are we any wiser, any more just, any more ample in our vision? You remember that when a clerical conference lamented the scanty attendance at the churches, Phillips Brooks naively remarked that he attached little importance to their complaints, for he himself never saw an empty church. Of course, he forgot that every one is not a Phillips Brooks. Men see what they go out to see, and nothing is easier than to deny the existence of what they don't want to see. Yes, that's true, said Gaunt, and I take the reproach myself. Oh, I don't mean to reproach you, said Gordon, although for that matter the reproach touches me as much as you. My point is that the very constitution of these great modern cities makes for specialized forms of life. In a certain sense, it cannot be avoided. Men naturally fall into a groove, live in the company of their social equals, and after a time forget that a universe of strange things lies around them, just outside the groove. But with you and me it should be different. We are aiming at things that should affect the general life, and we must needs seek a thorough understanding of our world. You don't expect the soldier in the ranks to study the strength and capacity of fortresses, the roads and byways and riverfords of strange countries, and all the thousands of details of a great campaign. But the great captain must know these things, or his campaign will be a failure. It may be that you and I are only captains in a very small way, but not the less we must know our facts if we are going to do anything. Gordon put on his long black cloak, and the two men went out. They traveled eastward, ever eastward, until they left the cars at a point a little south of 14th Street. Now, said Gordon, I want you to observe carefully what you see. It's many years since I first discovered this district, and since then it has altered for the worse. Yonder lies the New York we know, with its churches, colleges, and clubs, its hosts of pleasant and refined people, its green parks and its mansions, its thoughtless, pleasure-loving throngs, its orgies of social display, its almost insane extravagance. Now, let's look at this New York. On every side rose towering tenements, the bastions of poverty containing hundreds of rooms into which sunlight and fresh air never penetrated. The streets were narrow, crowded, unsavory, and it was noticeable that there were few children in them. Upon the faces of the people, as they went to and fro, there was a peculiar pallor, such as flowers that had been left too long in the dark. The people themselves were not ill-dressed. There were none of those figures clothed in dreadful rags which might have been seen in a London slum, nor were there bestial faces sodden with alcohol and disfigured by ferocious passions, which Paris can display when she vomits up a commune from her foul abyss. But there was something even more pitiable, a certain dull hopelessness which characterizes creatures long subject to ill usage. The look one sees in the eyes of a beaten dog or a starved horse. Both men and women walked with eyes turned downward. They had a furtive, stealthy air, as though they feared something which they could not see. Here and there windows in these vast populous towers were open, and from every open window came the endless whir and click-clack of sewing machines. One could fancy the whole district be stricken by some gigantic and relentless slave-master, some monstrous figure whose cruel eyes watched every room, whose vast hands thrust through vain secrecies of walls and doors, held men and women at interminable task, or dragged them forth to feed the maw of some horrible machine whose appetite was never satiated. "This is the New York I want you to see," said Gordon. "Tell me what strikes you about it." "I see no children," said Gaunt. "Where are they?" "They are all at work," said Gordon. "These children never play. There are 60,000 children in New York shut up in tenement houses like these, or even worse places, not one of whom knows what a game is. Most of them will never go to school in spite of all the efforts of truant officers. Even baby fingers can earn a cent an hour in sweated labor. And these little ones begin a life of slavery in the very moment when they leave their cradles." They were passing at that moment the door of a tenement house. Out of the door came two grotesque creatures, who appeared too small, moving heaps of clothes. They were a boy and a girl, perhaps about 9 or 10 years of age. Upon their frail shoulders was piled up a heap of garments, which would have been a sufficient load for a strong man. They strained and swayed beneath the burden. The boy was bow-legged, the girl flat-chested, undersized and spindly. The face of each wore the same expression of dull endurance. Gordon stooped and said a kind word or two to the unchildlike children. They simply stared at him. Kindness was a thing they had never known, and it was unintelligible to them. It was clear they regarded the old man with a vague fear, and suspected him of some design upon them. "And there are 60,000 children like that in New York," Gordon repeated. "And within 1 square mile of where we stand are 600,000 people, of whom those tiny drudges are the types." "Why, it's overwhelming," said Gaunt. "Is no one doing anything for them socially or religiously?" "Oh, something is being done, of course, but hardly anything in the right way. There are lots of these little societies of good people who come down from time to time and squirt a little rose water over the fetid mass of life, and come back with a fine report that the wilderness has really blossomed as the rose. I did that sort of thing myself. I'll tell you all about it some day. So don't suppose I speak slightingly of these kind but futile folk. I was very much in earnest, and I don't doubt that I did some good. But at last I came to see that rose water did not alter things. Do you know how these people live? They live in foul, unlighted rooms, some of them not more than 12 by 8 feet, nor 6 feet high. Yet in these rooms you will find 8 or 9 people living, cooking, eating, sleeping, and working. Think of what it means, year in and year out, this remorseless labor with a working day from 14 to 15 hours. And then tell me of what use little rosewater clubs and missions are in this inferno. They must make the devil laugh." The old man's voice shook with indignation. If he looked like a prophet as he had stood in the red sunset light at Riverside, he looked trebly so as he lifted his hand in accusation against these impenetrable fortresses of poverty, these creations of a heartless greed. They went on in silence for a time from street to street. The same scenes met them everywhere, always the same dull look of infinite fatigue in the faces of the people, the same frowning building shutting out the light, the same sense of lives dwarfed, imprisoned, bound upon the wheel. "Why don't they revolt?" cried Gaunt. "How is it that the poor don't all turn robbers and settle their debt with society that way?" "They will some day," said Gordon, "and even now they're settling their debt with society in ways more terrible than robbery. Why, there's fever and every kind of disease in these squalid rooms. There are people with smallpox on them working upon $100 suits of clothes, which will soon be on the backs of rich men, and the smallpox will go home with the suits of clothes. It is stated that $200 million worth of garments are manufactured in New York each year, and 9/10 of all these garments are stitched and sewn in dens like these. Half the disease in New York is nurtured here. These tenements are the barracks of the armies of death, and from them the destroying hosts will go out, silent and unseen, to reap a fearful harvest. But let us sit down somewhere. I've miscalculated my strength a little, and I'm tired." And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 9, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.